This is Beyond Species, a podcast exploring issues around speciesism and the struggle to dismantle it. In this episode, we hear from Meghana. As a woman of colour, Meghana is forced to navigate her own oppression within the animal rights movement while campaigning for justice for human and non-human animals and the environment. Hearing from Meghana, it's clear that those of us with privilege need to work harder to unpack it and to understand oppression if we ever want to reach liberation. Meghana finds hope in the decentralised anti-oppression work happening in Extinction Rebellion and Animal Rebellion. If you want to start then by giving us an introduction to your activism.
Okay. It's a little difficult to describe my activism because it constantly keeps evolving, and I'm involved in so many different things. Because I truly believe that all oppression is connected and all the issues that we see in our world is coming from the root causes of capitalism and colonialism. So currently, I am very involved with Extinction Rebellion in Toronto and with Animal Rebellion in UK. And I also sit in a few meetings with this local group called ACMGIS, which is Artists in Climate and Migrant Justice and Indigenous Sovereignty. But I also constantly show up for actions led by several Indigenous groups locally, especially Rising Tide Toronto, No One is Illegal, the Porcupine Warriors. There's also some incredible youth led movements, Fridays for Future and Climate Justice Toronto, that also look at these issues in a very intersectional manner. So I show up for their actions as much as I can as well.
Okay. Yeah, that is a lot of activism. So how many years would you say you've been doing activism now then?
That's a difficult one because I guess in the more serious way in which we look at how doing activism is probably for about a decade, but I feel like I've been doing activism since I was 8 years old, probably younger. My earliest memory of doing activism was with some of my classmates in school, where we heard that they were going to cut down a tree outside our classroom. So we bunked class and sat around the tree and refused to let them cut it.
Wow.
And there was another, probably when we were 9 or 10, where we saw some local villagers fishing some turtles out of the lake that was in our school. And because it's considered a local delicacy, and we kind of ran across like on both sides of the lake and got to them and grabbed the turtles out of their hand and put them back in the water and kind of, like, you can't do this, you can't kill these turtles. And so I think I've been doing this kind of stuff and not being afraid to speak up, even if it meant that I was going against the grain for a really long time.
So obviously your activism is anti-oppression.
Hmm.
Um, has it always been clear to you that activism, or at least the activism that you do in animal rights,
Hmm.
needs to be anti-oppression?
For sure. I mean, as a woman of color, I've probably had to be more of an activist than somebody else because I've had to fight for my own oppression most of my life. Always like not fitting the mold that you're expected to, not being allowed to speak up. And one of the reasons why I've always fought for other beings is because I've never wanted anyone else to feel like I did. And for me, that's where my activism comes from. Why would you want anybody else to feel like something that you wouldn't want to? And if you've been through abuse, if you've been shut down, if your life didn't matter, how would you feel? And would you want another sentient being to feel that way? And for me, it's just very simple. Like all animals want to feel loved and want to feel safe. And
Mm,
so it's just, I think I've become more like I'm able to make the connections and speak to it more as the years have gone by. Maybe I've
mm,
not been able to speak about it coherently when I was growing up. But for me, it was just always connected.
mhm, mm. Yeah, that's interesting that you say that because I often think, when you look at the mainstream vegan movement and you see who has positioned themselves as the people speaking up for the oppressed,
Mhm.
what you do see is a lot of white males.
Mhm.
Um, and I often think, okay, so there's something different about speaking up for the oppressed, having never really experienced oppression yourself,
Mhm.
and actually understanding what it's like to feel oppressed.
Mhm.
Um, and many of these vegan celebrities, if you want to call them that, uh, seem very, very confident that they know exactly how these animals feel,
Mhm.
and that they're the best placed people to explain oppression and rights and justice to um, to the general public,
Mhm.
um, without actually really having dug very deep into their own privilege,
Mhm.
and they've literally got no idea of what it feels like. Generally speaking, I would say,
Mhm.
you know, compared to that kind of authentic knowing experience, that lived experience that you've got, and that many other people in the world will have. So it's really interesting to hear that from you because the way it looks like the mainstream movement
Mhm.
is right now is, well, to me, I guess what I'm trying to say is it feels inauthentic,
Mhm.
and that many voices that should be heard, who actually understand what it's like to be oppressed and can bring a lot
Mhm.
to this struggle, are being shut out.
I mean, the sad reality is that most animal rights activists are women, but you will not hear their voices. Their behaviors are not the ones that you will find because it is such a white patriarchal space. And a lot of the people that are actually losing their lives defending animals and the land are people of color, people of marginalized communities, indigenous people. They're
Mhm,
the ones that are like actually doing a lot of the work and really not getting any space to be seen because that is not what even the Instagram algorithm is tuned to.
mhm.
Instagram won't even let people see my posts. I'm
Yeah.
just way too left wing and way too brown, way too unapologetic, and that's just what these people thrive on. And the sad thing is like when you look at some of the messaging of these white male celebrity vegans, I mean, that's why they get it so wrong when they have no idea about how to speak about rape culture or misogyny. It just clearly shows up because how could they possibly know? But having
Mm,
said that, it is possible to actually unpack all of this and learn, but it takes a long time and it takes a lot of humility. I mean,
mhm,
just because 'cause I'm a brown woman doesn't mean I know how all oppression feels.
mm,
And it doesn't mean that years ago I might have made some of the same mistakes of saying things like, "Oh, like no human could know how it feels like how animals feel." But it's just being humble to that and understanding that you made these mistakes too. But then you listened and you learned and you watched and you observed and you educated yourself to realize how wrong that is.
mhm.
And be willing to unpack that and acknowledge, oh my God, I cannot believe that was me. And being able to live with that. And that's where the growth comes from.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, humility is really the starting point, isn't it? It's
Mhm,
acknowledging that I don't know everything. I don't
mhm,
always know the best way, and that actually that's okay.
mhm,
But I wonder if with veganism, people are so used to having to defend their position against, you know, the society, against their family, against their friends,
mhm,
against everyone once they go vegan, and that we look for these factual answers to things,
mhm, mhm,
and that any sign of I think it probably is a white male thing as well, particularly any sign of weakness in
mhm,
quotes
mhm,
would be seen at any, or maybe perhaps any sign of vulnerability would show as a weakness, when in fact, you know, there's so much to this that there is no way to ever learn it all. You
mhm.
just need to start, um, start listening for starters, I guess.
Exactly. I mean, what we do in our activism, any of us, including me in a city doing protests and stuff, I mean, honestly, we're just starting. We're just so basic compared to like indigenous folk that are like giving up their lives, standing up
Mm,
in blockades to armies. They're the
mhm,
real environmental resistance. And they're fighting for our future that I don't even feel like we deserve sometimes. And
mhm,
like, I understand, like, when people become vegan, they're so traumatized and they're feeling so guilty because they've been complicit in this violence, and it really wakes them up. And that's why you tend to like then like unleash it onto other people who've not yet gotten there, seemingly forgetting that till 2 years ago you were eating animals. And I
mhm,
find that really difficult when animal rights activists have called me fake and that I'm diluting the movement because I care about the compassionate way in which you do activism when I've never eaten an animal in my life. I was stupid enough to like buy the lies of milk and eggs and all that, but I've never
mhm,
eaten an animal, like I've never had meat or seafood in my life. And I don't sit and hold that as a higher moral ground. For whatever reason, I was exposed to that kind of thinking and had those values in me to be able to make that choice. But then it took me so long to give up milk. And I have to acknowledge that. Why did I not give it up earlier when I had such ingrained values about violence and not hurting another? And a lot of activists, they just want to brush that aside. The fact that they went through a process to get there and they just want to concentrate on the trauma that's happening today and not hold themselves accountable to what they've caused their whole lives and then get so aggressive with others, and that's where they lose
mhm,
focus. Because I always ask, are you doing activism to be part of a cult or a religion or to be in this cool cliquey group, or are you doing this to save a life? Because if you can answer that honestly to yourself, the way in which you behave in a space of activism will completely change.
mhm. Yeah, I think there would be, if we really did keep the non-human animals at the forefront of what we were doing in this activism, there
Mhm.
would be a lot more humility,
Mhm.
and that kind of gravitas would be there, in our actions and in our words and our deeds, because there's such a kind of vitriolic narrative, I think, coming out of mainstream veganism anyway.
Mhm. I mean, and that's why a lot of groups like or a lot of movements like Animal Rebellion don't want to use the word vegan, not
Hmm.
because they don't believe in the values of what that stands for, but because it has become such a negative word because
Hmm.
of how much it has been misused by people like this that are in the focus.
Hmm.
And so that's why like I sometimes cringe to even say I'm vegan or to say I'm an
Hmm.
animal rights activist because people literally take 2 steps back. And I can't really blame them for it.
Hmm. It really doesn't feel like an inclusive movement.
Mm-mm.
Mhm.
Mm-mm.
We need, and it's bizarre that we've got only thinking of UK figures anyway, something like just over, I think it's maybe 2% of the population are vegan now.
Mhm.
Um, that is such a small amount that if we measured success in terms of how many people we convert to veganism anyway,
Mhm.
uh, we're obviously not doing very well at all.
Well, that's because a lot of vegan activists are vegan capitalists. They're just seeing progress in terms of how many vegan things we can eat and how many multinational chains are like serving vegan whatever. That is not liberation and that is not
Mhm,
showing progress. Like I I don't think I've been into a McDonald's or a KFC or a Burger King for over 20 years. And I
mhm,
stopped going into those businesses because of how they treat their workers and the fact that we're using genetically modified food without actually informing the people that were buying the food. So this was way before I turned vegan.
mhm,
And like just because they have a Beyond Meat burger, I won't go there
mhm.
because it's still against the other values that is basically using every living thing on this planet as a resource to be extracted.
Yeah, I was thinking about that recently about veganism really is a boycott. So, we decide, okay, I'm not going to support the meat industry.
Mhm.
But it's not a very effective boycott because the minute the meat industry introduces a plant-based item,
Mhm.
then you go and spend your money there anyway.
Mhm.
So, an effective boycott or a step towards an effective boycott would be to say, well, actually, I'm not going to support that industry no matter what they're selling me.
Mhm. And it is
Uh,
a difficult choice, and in some places, there might not be other options if you're vegan, and I get that. But the sad reality is, like, there's enough data now and articles to show that even though vegan products have increased, the meat consumption hasn't decreased, and in some cases, it's increased. And that is in itself enough proof to show that that isn't really working.
mhm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We've got more work to do on that.
Mhm.
Do you want to tell us some of your positive experiences you've had in activism, perhaps with Animal Rebellion or Extinction Rebellion?
Sure. So, um, the thing with Animal Rebellion and Extinction Rebellion that I really like is that we're not an organization. So, we don't have any HR to go to. We don't have a hierarchy of power. We try
Mhm,
to work in a holocratic way. And so that means, for example, like XR in Toronto is very different to XR in London, and that's okay. And like I couldn't work for XR UK right now because I wouldn't be okay with some of the things that they stand for. But I could work for XR Toronto and XR Scotland.
mhm,
And the same thing goes with the Animal Rebellion because what in these two movements, what we're trying to do is we're trying to model what we would like to see in the world. It's a really difficult task. And we, in the core group, we're all very aware that this is an experiment. We're still learning, we're still figuring it out. We're still saying, like, oops, that didn't work. That's not how we should have gone about this. We need to do this better. And that's the reason I can be in these movements. And the chapters that I'm involved in, these are spaces where I have been openly like been able to speak about my oppression and never felt shut down. In fact, I'm surrounded by people who give me the space to speak up, make them really uncomfortable, and acknowledge their lack of understanding and how much more that they need to educate themselves as well. And for me, that's the kind of space I want to be in because we can't all wake up one day and then completely have unpacked all of this privilege and everything and just completely understand it. That's impossible. It's a
mhm,
process. And the first step is just like actually being willing to sit even for half an hour in this really uncomfortable place while somebody's talking to you about how it feels to be a person of color or an indigenous person and you're squirming because it's so horrible to listen to but you're there and you're engaged and you're acknowledging this person. And that's the kind of spaces that I've been able to find in Extinction Rebellion in Toronto and in Animal Rebellion in UK. And, like, that's why there's so much variation, which might sometimes seem confusing, because we truly are a decentralized movement. We have a certain set of like values and principles, and as long as you adhere to that, you can say that you are representing XR or Animal Rebellion. But then again, like, then you start to sometimes have issues, right? Like, some people
Mhm.
can take that and make it whatever they want. And because we're not a hierarchical thing saying, like, you have to fit this box because nobody owns any of this, then, like, you can't see issues. And those are things that we're trying to grow and work through. Like, how do you deal with that? Like, if somebody's calling themselves Animal Rebellion somewhere and actually really not representing our principles and values, but what are you going to do? How are you going to shut them down? It's
Mm.
it's a difficult one, and it's something that we are constantly working on, and we tend not to um, we tend not to be a movement that thinks that we know everything or we know best,
Mhm.
and that we try not going to like sit and criticize other movements and organizations, but we're going to show how we're different by showing up differently.
Mm.
And that too is a process. Like right now, there's massive discussions happening in both the chapters that I work in about anti oppression. And we're trying to figure out, how do we talk about this without scaring away the people that are scared by these words? It's a really, really difficult task because, like, I mean, I'm sure you've noticed, like, you bring up the word intersectional, and then
Mhm.
there's this like raging war because people don't really understand what intersectional means half the
Mhm.
time, and the other half, like, their true colors come out. But
Yeah.
I mean, it's a it's like, how do we talk about like how all oppression is connected without using these words that maybe someone who hasn't read about it, who hasn't been in an academic environment, doesn't really understand. It's something that I'm still learning. How would I expect someone who's just been like mainstream activism to truly understand what it is without freaking out about it?
Mm.
So it's kind of really difficult. It's something that we really want to do, and the core groups are very, very majorly invested in anti-oppression work. And we are actually in XR Toronto yesterday evening. And today I actually had a call with Animal Rebellion in UK because I had a few concerns. And we spoke about the numerous meetings we're having in the next few weeks, which are all about, how do we disrupt whiteness in this movement? How do we get people to understand anti-oppression in the truest sense? How do we make these spaces safe for everybody? And
Mhm.
it's going to take time,
Mhm.
but I'm just glad to be in spaces where that awareness is there at least, and we're working on it.
Yeah. I mean, that's so important. I think the animal rights movement has been lacking so much is that kind of community building aspect.
Mhm.
It's been very focused on, I suppose, this franchise model of
Mhm.
organizing where you will show up to a protest, you'll see an event on Facebook, show up to the protest or a vigil or whatever,
Mhm.
and then do the thing for an hour. And
Mhm.
then, okay, you might eat with some people afterwards.
Mhm.
That's fine. And you kind of
Mhm.
talk about veganism and so on. But there isn't that kind of deep work going on that there is networking and there is some sharing of learning, but you're not sitting down with the purpose of actively unpacking,
Mhm.
privilege, supremacy,
Mhm.
and having these difficult conversations so much.
Mhm.
Um, so, from what you've said, it sounds like what Animal Rebellion are doing is probably the most constructive. I'm sure there are other organizations around the world doing this, but
Mhm.
maybe ones we don't hear so much about, like Food Empowerment Project.
Right, right. Maybe not in the animal rights movement. In other movements, I see this
Yeah.
kind of work, But,
Mm-hmm.
like, we have, like, in Animal Rebellion, there's a huge focus on regenerative culture. And
Mm-hmm.
the fact that, like, you're expected to go to an orientation, which talks about a lot about our principles and values. And that's a huge component, not just like what we stand for as a movement, what are our demands or anything. But there's a large focus on our principles and values. So people really understand that if you want to show up as Animal Rebellion, you have to be adhering to certain principles and values because that's the community that we want to build. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why we have culture, like a culture working group. And in that, there's an anti oppression working group, and there's a regenerative working group, and conflict resolution working group. And like when we do actions, a lot of what rebellion does is like kind of modeled off some of the things that XR is built. And part of that is like when you do actions, you have a briefing before, a moment to come together and like focus on why we're really there, and like address people's concerns. And then you do a debrief after, which is not just about going and like hanging out somewhere, but actually talking about how somebody felt like during an
Mm-hmm.
action, what they thought was wrong, how can we do better next time. And there's always like a regen person at every action walking around, not just because they have a first aid kit, but checking on people's feelings and emotions. Like a new activist, how are they feeling? Are they feeling okay? Are they feeling safe? Is someone feeling threatened? And that's a huge focus of these
Mm-hmm.
movements. And it's just like a relief to see that in the animal rights movement, like actually taking care of each other, not just, like, oh yeah, we showed up in the same clothes and took a picture together, so we're bonded. It, it's just extremely
Yeah.
superficial.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that kind of inauthentic kind of surface level, we're all in this together
Mhm.
kind of approach, you know. We're
Mhm.
in this for the animals.
Mhm.
Um, I still see comments on social media, people saying things like, you know, if I meet someone who's a vegan, I know they're a compassionate person and I can trust
Mhm.
them and things like that.
No.
And you know, the things that have been going on in certain groups obviously are testament to the fact that that isn't the case. You
Mhm.
know, you don't, when you become vegan, you don't immediately become a compassionate and moral
No.
person. It just means you've connected with something, which is good.
Mhm. Mhm.
But to unpack your speciesism,
Yeah.
it's going to take a long time, and it's going to be a lifelong project.
Mhm.
And not only that, but that should lead you down the other roads. Like for me as a white male, to start looking at my own privilege, my white privilege, male privilege,
Mhm.
abled privilege.
Yeah.
Um, so I think people need to recognize that a lot more.
Mhm.
And when we start thinking like that about, you know, okay, privilege and oppression, then you start really realizing that we need to actively create these safe spaces.
Mhm.
And I just don't think there's been enough of that done
Mhm.
because, you know, when I've looked at some of the actions that I've been to,
Mhm.
and I look at some of the people who attended, that I
Mhm.
didn't at the time realize that what some of their views were,
Mhm.
you know, and then I think, wow, knowing what I know now, I would never work with that person again.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, and that's why like Animal Rebellion in the UK, like we're working with people like Lila Kassam of Animal Think Tank, who is really, really looking at anti-oppression and the animal justice movement. Like having her come do talks with Animal Rebellion and workshops. And Lila is amazing. The work she does for anti-oppression is incredible.
Mm,
And like even like really woke people would not be ready for some of it, that's the
mm,
thing. Like you can't expect everyone to get there right away, but then you also need to like check these behaviors right away. The fact that I've had people recently tell me that, oh, if I don't want to have oppression and animal rights like events, because I have stopped going to animal rights events in Toronto for a little while now because I don't feel safe in those spaces. And kind of having people ask, like, but if you don't show up to speak up about it, then how do you expect it to change? So the fact that I'm expected to be around oppressive people and then like speak up for my own oppression, like, that's ridiculous.
Hmm.
And I mean, I do it anyway,
Hmm.
because I have a thick skin. I've lived in the white man's world for 15 years, and maybe I like being punished. I don't know, but I just keep hoping that some point something will change. More of people like me will feel like they can come into that space because I'm there.
Hmm.
That's the hope, but there's not a single day that goes by where I want to quit. There's not a
Hmm.
single day that goes by where you're just like, "This is too hard.
Hmm.
I don't wanna do this anymore." But
Hmm.
then what other choice do I have?
Hmm.
That's kind of what I find myself with every day.
Yeah, and that's very different to the experience, I would say, of a lot of people in this movement. Well, certainly the mainstream movement. You know, activism shouldn't. I mean, I think it seems very performative a lot of the time, and it seems very easy a lot of the time. And I think it's easy. I understand that people are traumatized and horrified by the things that we see that people do to animals.
Mhm.
Um, and obviously, we need to take care of ourselves and each other in relation to that. But I think there's also, we are not the oppressed. You know,
Mm-mm.
the violence doesn't come back on us.
Mhm.
But having said that, as a person of color or a woman of color, um, basically anyone who's um, from a marginalized community,
Mhm.
these can be dangerous spaces.
Mhm. I mean, like, people don't get when how upsetting it is to, somebody who's indigenous or a person of color when they talk about like, "Oh, that cop was so nice," or, "The police
Mm,
are actually trying to help us." Because when they get arrested during an action in a city, and they're all white folk getting arrested, the amount of brutal force the a police will use is going to be so different to what they're doing right now to indigenous people, where the cameras are not allowed, where their lives matter lesser than white folk.
mm,
And like, it's a weird thing for me because I grew up in India where you just don't trust the cops. And as a woman, like, who went through abuse, I didn't feel safe enough to go to the cops and tell them about it because they would just make fun of me and probably judge my character.
mm,
And then I moved to New Zealand, and I actually felt like I could go to police there, which was really strange. And they did actually help me out once. Um, so I know there's like varying degrees, but like, for example, in Canada, I'm scared every time I see a police.
mm,
Like, I am scared because they could come and ask me for my work papers and take me to a detention center, and there's nothing I can do. So I can
mm,
only imagine how an indigenous person feels when their land has been taken over. They didn't cede it, it's completely stolen, and
mm,
they're calling them protesters when they're just defending their own homes. And so that's why these movements end up being just so white. Because when you start talking about the police like that, when you start like just making it so simplistic what the relationship was with the police, you're alienating people who've not had the same experience as you. You're
mm,
alienating people who do not understand or know or will ever know how it is to live with privilege.
mm,
And that's where the movement is losing. We're so
mm,
focused on the animals that we're not, firstly, we're not remembering that we are animals too. So if you're an animal rights activist, you should really be fighting for humans too.
mm,
I never get that when I've had to argue with people. I'm like, I think I'm educated with biology enough to know for a fact that we're, human animals and non-human animals, but we're all animals.
Yeah.
Um, but it's just if we don't start to like notice the little things that we do about, I'm sure you've seen it. There's a few accounts of like white, even female activists like boasting about how many times they were arrested,
Mm.
how many charges they had.
Hmm.
That's not something to be proud of. And that's really insulting. Like they got charged and arrested so many times and they're free. Most of
Hmm.
them are free. Most of them didn't get completely brutally handled. Like other people might not get out of jail for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I have seen that. This seems to be a kind of new trend within the activist community, at least on social media, that because there's obviously been a lot of actions where people go into farms and
Mhm,
slaughterhouses and things like that en masse. There's been a lot of arrests, so you know, mainly the organizers get arrested,
mhm,
um, and then yeah, there is this kind of sort of blasé attitude towards getting arrested.
mhm,
The thing that annoys me the most, I think, is that they kind of pull on the civil rights movement and say, and they use like Martin Luther King quotes and things like that to
mhm,
talk about, the fight for justice. People have always got arrested in the past, and this is par for the course. You've got to challenge unjust laws.
mhm,
But um, yeah, if you're getting arrested that many times, I think you need to ask yourself, is your security culture good enough?
mhm, mhm.
But also, like you say, it's that privilege because there's some people, and they're, people of color, for example, might be arrested once, and
Mhm,
that's it. Once they're in the system, depending on what country you're in,
mhm.
and also there's financial resources. I mean, where does that come from?
I think my issue is that I feel like a lot of these actions recently, like you kind of do it with the goal of being arrested. I understand that arrest can happen because some of the risky actions, but the recent DXE Brighton one, like what was great about that was that nobody got arrested and they were able to save so many lives. Now that's a win. But
Yeah.
then like to go in with like my purpose is to get arrested. That's the problem, and then talking about it as if they've made a sacrifice. Tell me, what has a middle class white male or a female, what are they sacrificing? They have someone to bail them out, they're not losing the quality of their life, they have the resources for it, they'll go fund me something, and then people will give their money to them. What are they sacrificing? Like, I've
Hmm.
had indigenous folk, like, reach out to me about how pissed off that makes them. Like, what the hell do these people think they're sacrificing? My people
Hmm.
are sacrificing our lives and our freedom every single day, fighting for everybody's water and land. It's so insulting to
Hmm.
people that are doing insanely difficult work.
Hmm.
And it's just like, I get it. I know I get that the whole logic behind if you get arrested, then it makes the news because that's all the media cares about, sensationalism, and then we get our message in the media. I do understand that, but I think you need to think about um, how pointed, how directed, how meaningful is the action that you're doing to just really weigh out, is this really worth doing something that we're getting arrested? And like that's one of the things, like in XR Toronto, we blocked a bridge in October.
Hmm.
I wasn't unfortunately involved in a lot of the planning before, um, but there was a lot of criticism about how this bridge was maybe affecting a part of the city where there's a lot of working people, and that disrupted their day, which doesn't help because Toronto is a really difficult city to earn enough money in to live.
Hmm.
And so we're taking on that criticism really seriously. And now when you think of actions, it's about like who are we trying to disrupt? Who are we trying to inconvenience? Let's do this to inconvenience the government, the
Mhm.
corporations, the
Mhm.
rich people, like the business district, because that's who we want to disrupt. And so
Mhm.
it's just like I'm really grateful that I'm in a space where people are like critical enough to be like, "Oh yeah, we felt so good about that and we worked so hard for that." But then we're like understanding that we need to think more when we do these actions. Like
Mhm.
we need to evolve. And there's a very few like other animal rights groups or anything that is capable of like taking criticism on like that and actually evolving. Like,
Mhm.
when XR UK London, like, there was that whole protest with people jumping on the subway, we were all cringing. That was terrible.
Mhm.
That was terrible.
Yeah, it was. I mean, and the media had a field day with that as well,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
in terms of playing it off as a kind of a class thing. You
Mhm,
know, these well-off white boys didn't realize they were interfering with working class Londoners'
mhm.
days, and
Yeah,
so they could put that spin on it.
mhm,
But yeah, without, and obviously they're not going to point out that actually XR is decentralized and that this was a bad a bad decision by a few
mhm.
people.
Exactly.
Um, yeah, that's interesting. So now talking about this kind of thing, police and arrests and this
Mhm,
kind of culture. Obviously, Animal Rebellion, the first time round when they did the October Rebellion,
mhm,
had some of this stuff going on as well. So, what do you
mhm.
think about that? Has there been talk on that? Is there going to be a change of approach or?
It's definitely getting discussed. So the thing was when Animal Rebellion did the October Rebellion, it was, like, even newer than Extinction Rebellion was.
Mm,
It just kind of started a few months before that, and the groups were just starting to like actually function, and like our culture was being defined, and it was just like there was this like deadline rushing towards everybody, and
mhm,
so a lot of things got missed. So after the October Rebellion, there was like a bit of a moratorium on actions for a while because we were reassessing things that we didn't like, things that we need to work on, things that need to be addressed, and actually going back to our basics and fixing all the issues and the problems that we're seeing. And
mhm,
then there is a lot of discussion and talk about how not to repeat these kind of mistakes. Having said that, there can always be people who come show up there as Animal Rebellion and do these really stupid, ignorant things, like
mm,
calling cops our friends. And that's not something that we can entirely control because honestly, we're rebellion. Like, we're not there to control people. But as much as we can as a movement, there is a lot of discussion and thought being put into it right now before actions are planned, how
mhm,
aware we are going to be about these issues. So it's definitely something that the core organizers take really, really to heart.
mhm,
It disturbs us. It really is something that we cringe at. Like, and I think that's what I like about it. Like the fact that, some of these celebrities were being pushed, their speeches were like the public ones when the people actually doing all the organizing, working 80 hours a week, like their voices weren't heard. And
mm,
those are all things that we're trying to remedy for the
yeah.
next rebellion and be like, this can't happen. And to be fair, like there was one activist that Animal Rebellion UK posted about, and they weren't aware of the fact that this person had sexual harassment claims against him
Okay.
because they just didn't know it was a different country. And I reached out to them because a bunch of people here reached out to me and they took it down right away. Like, there is no space for harassment and animal rebellion. But then there's always a few people that manage to get through the cracks because, they're so good at pretending and playing these stories as people are. And some people have never been exposed. And those are things that are difficult situations to deal with. And we try our best. Like, they didn't ask a single question. They're like, if there's that many harassment claims, we trust you, and like this, we will not be promoting this person or
Mm.
posting them on our profile ever again.
Mhm.
And so, like, there's that willingness to learn, right? And be like,
Yeah.
"Oh my god, we didn't know that. That's
Mhm.
horrible. We need to, like, check this better next time maybe."
Mm.
And so, like, I'm hoping that doesn't happen because honestly, like, I am an Animal Rebellion and Extinction Rebellion because I see it as the best possibility
Mhm.
right now. But I also know that this might just be one version of something and something better is maybe about to come. And
Mm.
if I see some of these behaviors again in the Spring Rebellion, I might not want to be involved in it.
Mhm.
And that's okay. Like, I
Mm.
think that's what people need to be not afraid of. People end up staying in organizations because they see there's no like, otherwise where else can I go do my work? And otherwise which other group is better?
Mm.
And, like, there's times like in India, about a year and a half ago, I was working with a local group that was incredibly oppressive. Abolitionist vegan is what they call themselves. And they were
Mhm.
like shaming people on the streets and really bad behavior. And I didn't know any other group there, and I was going to stay, and I quit with that
Mhm.
group, no association, and I started doing outreach by myself.
Mhm.
And I think, like, I hope that some of the issues that are coming up now with, organizations like AV, like, at least
Mm.
gets this conversation started that you shouldn't be afraid of, like, stepping out and starting your own thing or wanting to, like, get together with another group of people that have the same values as you. Because if we want to see that change in the world, we can't keep perpetuating it just because we're afraid of, oh, but there's nothing else.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's like that. The way I think of it is, a lot of these organizations and charities, the way they've created their formal structure is just a
Mhm.
replica of what's happening in society. It's a hierarchical structure.
Mhm.
um, the power goes to the organizers. They take the responsibilities, and that's a
Mhm.
lot of weight on them as well. Because you want to be able to spread the load and make it inclusive and hear from different people.
Mhm.
But if all we're going to do is just keep rehashing these models of how we work with people,
Mhm.
then we're not really countercultural at all.
Mhm.
So we're not challenging um, the mainstream. And I think the animal rights movement has to be at the very least anti-capitalist.
Mhm.
And I think there's a lot of ways to do that. Like, I think anarchism is so confusing for a
Mhm.
lot of people, and there's so much to learn about it
Mhm.
that I'm still trying to figure out exactly what it's all about. But I don't think you need to necessarily find just one particular strand,
Mhm.
that this is the one thing you're going to stick to, the one philosophy that's going to have all the answers. But to know that actually that capitalism is the problem,
Mhm.
and that you need to be anti-capitalist, and
Mhm.
there are multiple different ways of approaching that.
Mhm.
So I would like to see, or I think what might be more successful is smaller groups in local communities that don't
Mhm.
necessarily have to be um, tied to like an umbrella
Mhm.
organization,
Mhm.
but they're empowered to themselves within their own community to take action within their
Mhm.
own community,
Mhm.
and also draw on the expertise and learning from other groups and
Right.
network with them. So if there's an idea to have a bigger action, let's shut down a city for a day, then
Mhm.
these groups can work together.
Right.
And I guess XR and Animal Rebellion is kind of along those lines.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do, like,
Hmm.
but that doesn't always happen in every chapter. For
Mm.
example, Extinction Rebellion in Toronto, we passed our own fourth demand.
Okay.
And it's not like from consultation across Canada, it's what we want as a chapter to be part of our demands.
Hmm.
And that's totally fine. Nobody can tell us that we can't do that. Like we're taking some of the structural things from Extinction Rebellion, but how we want to talk about things here is completely up to us.
Mm.
And there is that freedom, but it's just like I can't speak for other chapters, right? And how
Hmm.
that's being implemented. Like I used to work in Animal Rebellion Canada, and if it was truly working and understanding what is coming from Animal Rebellion in UK, then I would still be able to work in it, but it's not. There's some of it that's getting lost in translation, sometimes because of the people that have become the people that started it or more in charge, and that's again an issue.
Mm.
Like in Extinction Rebellion, we have co-leads in every group, but that is it's flexible, it keeps moving. We have coordinators meetings, but anybody who's an active working group member can show up and completely welcome. In Animal Rebellion, there's actually talk about like not using the word coordinator because
Mm.
it actually sounds very much like a position of power. So we're talking about actively even like changing terminology to
Mm.
actually reflect what we would like to see. Um,
Hmm.
and it's hard because like we're so set in our ways, like no matter how much we don't want hierarchy, most of us don't know how to work without it.
Yeah.
We keep looking for it. And that's part of the whole fact that our society is based on white supremacy culture. And
Mm.
people think that that's just about like white privilege, but it's actually about how we show up in the world. You know, things like power hoarding, perfectionism, and like the the value given to the written word. Those are all things that show up in white supremacy culture. And
Mm.
it's really hard to be super aware of those and unpack those and try to behave differently. Like, just because I'm a brown woman doesn't mean that there's a few things that I do that fall under white supremacy culture because that's the society I've lived in. That's how I've been taught to function in society. So for me in itself, last year, just sitting in this workshop learning more about it, I was just like, oh my God, I do that. That's terrible.
Mm.
How do I change that behavior?
Mm.
And I think that's what people need to be like less afraid or defensive about. Just like being able to stop and be like, oh my God, could it be that I'm misunderstanding this, that I'm actually promoting this behavior? And that's really hard. It's really hard to do that. Maybe as a teenager, there's just no way in hell I would listen to someone talking like this.
Mm.
I'd be like, "No, you don't tell me what to think, like, I'm right." That's probably what I would have done.
Mm.
So it's just so that's what we're trying to change in these movements. The fact that each chapter, like, for example, even though Animal Rebellion in the UK wants to work under holacracy,
Mm.
if Animal Rebellion in Canada doesn't want to adopt holacracy, doesn't have to at all. It's completely up to each chapter to take those basic values and principles and make it whatever they want to.
Yeah. Well, that's so important, I think, because each community is going to be different.
Mhm.
And if you want to be able to respond effectively to
Mhm.
what's happening in your own local area, then, who knows that area best? It's the people who live there and work there.
Exactly. Exactly. Like Toronto as a ecosystem is completely different to like Montreal or Vancouver even.
Hmm.
And so we acknowledge that they have their own fourth demands. And there was a bit of a try to make a cross Canada fourth demand. But this is the words that we're comfortable with, that we've spent months coming up with. And so that's what we're going to hold on to because that's our voice. That's what makes sense for Toronto.
Hmm. Yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing we should be doing. Um, what do you think? Okay, this is like an impossible question. I'm going to ask you, what do you think the future of the animal rights movement looks like? But that's probably no one can answer that. It's way too ambitious. But I don't know. Where do you think we go from here? I suppose. What are the next steps?
I think if the animal rights movement doesn't wake up to its inadequacies, the things that we've been doing wrong, the things that we need to actively educate ourselves about. I I fear that we will never achieve animal liberation with single issue activism, with people that have no real understanding of oppression. I'm afraid of that. I'm
Mm.
afraid that we're just going to be stuck in this vegan capitalist goals, and that's going to get us nowhere near liberation. And you cannot have liberation for one set of oppressed beings while there's still oppression for another set of oppressed beings. Um, and like I see some hope because out of these really volatile discussions and conversations that are happening all over the internet,
Mm.
there's people starting to be more comfortable in their skin and talking about how they're not okay with this, and that means they're able to find each other, which could help the movement, because then they feel empowered to like work with each other and know that there's others that think like them
Mm.
and not have to conform to what's expected. But I think it's like kind of reflective of what's happening in the world, like as you know, there's like fascism just coming out everywhere really openly, like alt-right coming out really openly. And I
Yeah.
think the world is going through this really incredible period of time, which is also really painful and uncomfortable, where these like really opposing views and ways of being is really openly clashing with each other. And I
Mm.
can hope that actually leads us to being able to heal and work through it. But I'm also afraid because I, in some ways, like I had the privilege of, for whatever reason, ending up in New Zealand,
Mm.
which is a far more equitable society than most countries. And don't get me wrong, there's like issues in New Zealand too. But the way they, like as Kiwis, the relationship that we have with indigenous people is far beyond most other countries can even imagine.
Mm.
And maybe that's why I expect more. And I expect more even out of New Zealand. Like we
Mm.
should be doing more for the Maori and addressing inequities. So I'm hoping that more of that comes out, more of our Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, and like more people like that come out. Like we need more women to be speaking up and their voices to be heard. We need more people from different backgrounds to be heard. Um, and I think it's on us to really take on that responsibility of amplifying voices. It's
Mm.
on us. If we don't see the voices that we want to hear in this world, what are we doing about it? Like we should be giving using any space, any platform we have to amplify those voices.
Mm.
And if we do that, then we have a good chance of actually moving towards animal rights movement that's truly inclusive, anti-oppressive, truly about liberation.